There are few things scarier than the ocean. It's dark, silent, impossibly deep. And in analog horror, that darkness becomes the perfect hiding place for things that should not exist. Some of these monsters are so large they can crush ships without trying. Others are terrifying because you might not even realize they're there until it's far too late. Today, we're diving into the deadliest ocean monsters in analog horror, and why surviving them is basically impossible. Welcome to Horror Index, where every monster has a file. For this list, I'm looking at a few things: how dangerous these creatures are, how hard they are to escape, and how much destruction they can cause once they appear. Let's start with one of the strangest humanoids ever imagined beneath the ice-cold sea. One. The Ningen is one of the creepiest ocean monsters ever associated with analog-style horror. At first glance, it looks almost simple, a massive pale humanoid shape drifting through freezing waters. But that simplicity is exactly what makes it so disturbing. It doesn't look like a fish. It doesn't look like a whale. It looks wrong in a way your brain instantly rejects. The Ningen is terrifying because of the uncertainty around it. Depending on the version, it can be dozens of meters long, move silently, and appear almost human from a distance. That means if you see it in the water, your mind might hesitate for one fatal second before realizing that what you're looking at is not a person, not an animal, and definitely not something you can fight. And the environment makes everything worse. The Ningen is usually tied to cold, remote waters, places where visibility is terrible, help is far away, and the ocean itself is already trying to kill you. So even if the creature doesn't attack immediately, you're still trapped in its world. What makes it deadly isn't just brute force, it's scale isolation, and the fact that in open water there is nowhere to hide. Tiddy. The deep blue, if the Ningen is the fear of seeing something possible, the deep blue is the fear of never seeing it clearly at all. In analog horror, the ocean often becomes a void, a place where something huge can exist just beyond the reach of light. The terror of the deep blue comes from implication. You don't always get a full reveal. You get fragments, distorted footage, warnings, shapes moving under black water. And honestly, that makes it even scarier, because if a creature can live far below the visible ocean, then by the time you know it exists, you're already in danger. Ships, divers, and isolated coastal communities are all vulnerable. Unlike a land monster, an abyssal predator doesn't need roads, doors, or open terrain. It has an entire three-dimensional hunting ground. That means it can come from below, disappear below, and remain hidden almost indefinitely. The real horror here is helplessness. In most analog horror stories, humans understand almost nothing about the ocean creature stalking them. They don't know its size, behavior, intelligence, or limits. And when you don't know a monster's limits, you have to assume the worst. That's what makes the deep blue one of the deadliest ideas in analog horror. It turns the entire ocean into enemy territory. 3. Godzilla Bloodbath. Next up is Godzilla Bloodbath, one of the most visually overwhelming seaborne threats in analog horror. This kind of monster works because it takes a familiar giant creature concept and pushes it into a far more nightmarish direction. Instead of just being huge, it feels corrupted, unstoppable, and almost mythic in scale. A creature like this is deadly for a very simple reason. If it enters your area, normal survival rules stop mattering. Boats are meaningless. Coastal buildings are meaningless. Even military force starts to look pathetic when the monster is large enough to ignore conventional resistance. It doesn't just hunt individuals. It transforms entire regions into disaster zones, and that's a major difference between ocean horror and other forms of horror. A sea monster doesn't even need to target you personally. If it rises near your city, your port, or your shipping route, thousands of people can be in danger before anyone understands what's happening. Godzilla Bloodbath also represents something else analog horror does extremely well: the idea that a monster can feel ancient, unnatural, and larger than human civilization itself. You're not dealing with an animal. You're dealing with an event. And when the monster itself feels like a catastrophe, survival becomes less about escaping a creature and more about surviving the collapse that follows it. 4. The Horned Serpent. Even though the Horned Serpent is often discussed as a broader colossal entity rather than a pure ocean animal, it absolutely belongs in any conversation about water-linked analog horror monsters. Why question mark? Because creatures like this tap into one of the oldest human fears imaginable: the idea that something vast is sleeping beneath us. The Horned Serpent is terrifying because it combines scale with mythic presence. It doesn't feel like a normal predator. It feels like a buried truth, a living disaster, or a force of nature disguised as a monster. When analog horror presents something at this scale, the fear changes. It's no longer, can I outrun it? It becomes, what happens to the world if this thing fully emerges? That kind of threat is almost impossible to survive because it breaks the logic of individual survival. If a monster is large enough to affect entire landscapes, coastlines, or systems, then hiding becomes pointless. Escape becomes temporary. The danger is no longer local. And when a water-connected titan is involved, it gains another layer of fear. unpredictability. Water carries destruction. It spreads panic. It hides movement. It makes the monster feel like it can rise anywhere. That's what makes the Horned Serpent so deadly. Not just what it is, but how small it makes humanity look. 5. The Suez Canal Crab. If there's one ocean-related analog horror monster that feels absurd, iconic, and genuinely terrifying at the same time, it's the Suez Canal Crab. At first, the concept sounds almost ridiculous, an impossibly massive crab associated with one of the most important waterways on Earth. But that weirdness is exactly why it works so well in analog horror. It takes something almost laughable and turns it into something deeply unsettling. The Suez Canal Crab is deadly because it weaponizes size and geography. A normal monster kills people. This thing can choke one of the world's most critical trade routes. It can immobilize ships, cause infrastructure chaos, and create the kind of disruption that cascades far beyond the immediate attack zone. In other words, it isn't just dangerous to whoever sees it. It's dangerous to entire systems. And like the best analog horror creatures, it also feels deeply unnatural. It's too large, too misplaced, and too bizarre to fit into the real world, which makes every appearance feel like reality itself is malfunctioning. That's an underrated kind of fear. Some monsters scare you because they're violent. Others scare you because their existence means the world is no longer operating by rules. You can understand. The Suez Canal Crab does both. It's absurd, it's huge, it's memorable, and if you were anywhere near it, your odds of survival would be almost zero. Outro, wrap up. So which of these ocean monsters is the deadliest? If we're talking pure mystery, it might be the Ningen. If we're talking helplessness, it could be the deep blue. If we're talking raw destructive scale, Godzilla Bloodbath. The Horned Serpent and the Suez Canal Crab are on a completely different level. But the real reason ocean monsters work so well in analog horror is simple. The sea already feels alien. Analog horror just gives that alien darkness a face. If you want more videos on analog horror creatures, hidden entities, and the monsters you would definitely not survive, subscribe to Horror Index. And tell me in the comments, which ocean monster would terrify you the most?